The 22nd of June, 1941, 3:15 a.m. The longest day of the year is about to become the bloodiest day in human history. Along a front line stretching 1,800 miles from the frozen Baltic Sea in the north to the warm waters of the Black Sea in the south, silence hangs heavy over the border. On the western side of the River Bug, over 3 million men are waiting in the darkness. They are the finest soldiers of the Wehrmacht. They are supported by 600,000 vehicles, 3,000 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft. It is the largest invasion force ever assembled, a force so massive it defies comprehension. Their target is the Soviet Union, a sprawling giant that covers 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. In Berlin, the mood is not one of caution, but of supreme confidence. The architect of this madness, Adolf Hitler, has assured his generals with a chilling prophecy. He said, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." He was wrong. This is the story of Operation Barbarossa. It is not just a story of battles and maps. It is a forensic analysis of a colossal failure. It is the story of how the most efficient military machine in the world choked on its own ambition. It is the story of mud, ice, and an underestimation that would cost millions of lives. Why did 8 million troops collapse? The answer lies not just in the winter snow, but in the very first hour of the invasion. Let us go back to that morning. The signal code is Dortmund. At 3:15 a.m., the sky erupts. Thousands of German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The ground shakes with a violence that registers on seismographs thousands of miles away. Before the echo of the first barrage fades, the Luftwaffe is already airborne. Their mission is precise and ruthless. Destroy the Soviet Air Force while it is still sleeping on the ground. And it works. In the first day alone, over 1,200 Soviet aircraft are destroyed. Most never even leave the runway. The Red Army is blinded. Command centers are bombed into silence. Stalin, the man of steel, is paralyzed by shock in the Kremlin, refusing to believe that his temporary ally has betrayed him. For the German soldiers on the ground, it feels like a training exercise. The border guards are overrun. The panzer divisions, the iron fist of the Blitzkrieg, punch through the Soviet lines with terrifying speed. Army Group North races toward Leningrad. Army Group South drives toward the oil fields and the wheat of Ukraine. And in the center, the most powerful force, Army Group Center, aims straight for the heart, Moscow. The strategy relies on speed. The Germans call it Blitzkrieg lightning war. The doctrine is simple. Smash through the weak points, encircle the enemy, and force a surrender before the logistics break down. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. The German High Command saw no reason why it wouldn't work in Russia. But Russia is not France. In the first weeks, the numbers are staggering. At the Battle of Bialystok-Minsk, over 300,000 Soviet soldiers are encircled and captured. The German newsreels show endless columns of Russian prisoners, dusty and defeated, marching westward. To the outside world, the Soviet Union is finished. General Franz Halder, the chief of the German General Staff, writes in his diary on July 3rd, "It is not an exaggeration to say that the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days. 14 days. This entry in Halder's diary captures the fatal flaw of Operation Barbarossa. It reveals the arrogance that would lead to doom. The Germans were looking at the map, measuring distances in kilometers, but they were not measuring the friction of war. Even in these early days of victory, the cracks are already forming. You just have to look closely to see them. Look at the engines. The dust on the Russian unpaved roads is fine and abrasive. It gets into the air filters of the German tanks. It grinds down the pistons. Engines that were designed for the paved highways of Western Europe are overheating and breaking down after just a few hundred miles. Look at the rails. The Russian railway gauge is wider than the European standard. The German supply trains cannot run on Soviet tracks. Every mile the Wehrmacht advances, they move further away from their supplies. They have to offload cargo, reload it onto trucks, and drive it to the front. But there are few paved roads. Even in the dry summer heat, the logistics are a nightmare. And then there is the resistance. Yes, hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers surrendered, but many did not. In the Brest fortress, right on the border, a small garrison holds out for weeks, long after the German front line has moved hundreds of miles past them. They have no food, no water, and no hope. Yet, they fight to the last man. One soldier scratches an inscription on the wall. I am dying, but I do not surrender. Farewell, motherland. This is a warning. The Wehrmacht is used to fighting armies that surrender when they are outmaneuvered. Now, they are fighting an enemy that fights with a desperate, almost suicidal fatalism. By August, the German advance begins to slow down. Not because they are losing battles, but because they are exhausted. The sheer vastness of the landscape is swallowing them. Hitler had planned for a campaign of 3 to 4 months. He sent his soldiers into Russia wearing summer uniforms. There are no winter coats in the supply trucks. There is no antifreeze for the vehicles. Why would they need them? The war was supposed to be over before the first snow fell. But the Soviet Union has a resource that Germany ignored. Reserves. German intelligence estimated the Red Army had about 200 divisions. They believed that once these were destroyed, the Soviet state would collapse. By August, the Germans had indeed destroyed or neutralized 200 divisions. But the Soviets had simply raised 360 more. It is like fighting a hydra. You cut off one head, and 2 more appear. This is the moment where the strategic crisis begins. The German army is deep inside Russia. They have won victory after victory, but they have not won the war. And now, a disagreement breaks out in the German high command that will seal their fate. The generals want to drive straight for Moscow. It is the capital, the logistics hub, the nerve center. Capture Moscow, they argue, and you cut the head off the snake. But Hitler has a different idea. He looks south. He sees the grain of Ukraine. He sees the coal of the Donbass. He sees the oil of the Caucasus. He orders the panzers of Army Group Center to turn south to help capture Kiev. His generals are horrified. They argue that this will waste precious time. They argue that winter is coming. But Hitler is adamant. He calls his generals knights of the archaic school who do not understand economics. So, the panzers turn south. From a tactical perspective, it is a brilliant maneuver. The Battle of Kiev in September 1941 becomes the largest encirclement in the history of warfare. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers are captured. It is a catastrophic loss for the Red Army. But strategically, it is a disaster for Germany. Why? Because the Battle of Kiev takes time. It consumes fuel, it consumes ammunition, and most importantly, it consumes the calendar. While the Germans are celebrating the victory in Kiev, the leaves on the trees are starting to turn yellow. The temperature is dropping. The days are getting shorter, and the rains are coming. The German soldiers are tired. They have marched over 1,000 kilometers. Their boots are worn through. Their vehicles are patched together with wire and hope. They are stretched thin along a front line that is expanded as it moves east, like a rubber band about to snap. And yet, they are still confident. Moscow is still there. The capital is within reach. Operation Typhoon, the final assault on Moscow, is prepared. But the window of opportunity is closing fast. As September ends, the first heavy rains begin to fall on the Russian steppe. The dust turns into something else, something the Germans have no word for in their military manuals. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud. It starts with rain. But in Russia, rain does not just make the ground wet, it transforms the earth. Early October, 1941. The Rasputitsa has arrived. The unpaved roads, which were merely dusty tracks in the summer, now dissolve into rivers of thick, sticky glue. It is a mud so deep that it swallows boots, then wheels, then axles. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that relies on speed and maneuverability, grinds to a halt. It is not stopped by enemy fire. It is stopped by geography. German trucks sink up to their bonnets. To move a single vehicle requires teams of horses and hours of back-breaking labor. Supply convoys, the lifeline of the army, are paralyzed. Artillery shells, fuel, and food stop reaching the front lines. The Luftwaffe tries to drop supplies by air, but the weather grounds the planes. For the German soldier, it is a nightmare. They are pushing vehicles more than they are fighting. They are wet, cold, and covered in filth. The modern mechanized army of the 20th century is reduced to the speed of a Napoleonic march. But while the Germans are stuck in the mud, the Soviets are using the time. They are digging anti-tank ditches. They are laying mines. And they are bringing up a weapon that shocks the German commanders. The T-34 tank. When the Germans first encountered the T-34, they were stunned. The standard German anti-tank guns, the 37mm door knockers, simply bounced off its sloped armor. A German panzer commander, Heinz Guderian, reported with alarm that the Soviet tanks could engage them from distances where the German shells were useless. For the first time, the Germans do not have the technological superiority. They are fighting an enemy with better tanks, on their own soil, fighting for their very survival. By mid-November, the temperature drops. The mud freezes. The ground becomes hard as concrete. The German generals breathe a sigh of relief. The tanks can move again. Operation Typhoon, the drive to capture Moscow, resumes with full fury. They are only a few dozen miles from the capital. They can almost see the golden domes of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Panic grips Moscow. On October 16th, the Great Panic occurs. Government offices are evacuated. Secret documents are burned in the streets, the ash floating in the air like black snow. Stalin stays, but he orders the city to be turned into a fortress. Every able-bodied man and woman is sent to dig trenches. But as the Germans push forward, another enemy arrives on the battlefield. An enemy more ruthless than the Red Army. General Winter. The temperature plunges. Not gradually, but violently. It drops to minus 20 degrees Celsius. Then minus 30. Then minus 40. The Wehrmacht is totally unprepared. Remember, they expected to be home by Christmas. They are still wearing the same denim combat uniforms they wore in the summer heat of France. They stuff newspapers into their jackets to try to keep warm. They steal fur coats from Russian civilians. But it is not enough. Frostbite becomes a major casualty. Fingers turn black and have to be amputated. Eyelids freeze shut. Men die simply by sitting down to rest. The machines suffer just as much as the men. The oil in the engines turns into a thick gel. To start a tank in the morning, the crews have to light fires under the hull to thaw the engine block. The telescopic sights on the guns fog up and freeze. The bolts on the machine guns snap when fired because the metal has become brittle in the extreme cold. The German army is freezing to death. And while they freeze, something miraculous happens for the Soviets. For months, Stalin had kept his best troops in the east, in Siberia, guarding the border against a potential attack by Japan. These were fresh, well-fed troops, equipped with quilted winter uniforms, ski battalions, and rifles that worked in sub-zero temperatures. They were masters of winter warfare. Stalin did not dare move them, fearing a Japanese invasion. But then, a spy in Tokyo changed history. Richard Sorge. A German journalist working for the Soviet intelligence, Sorge sent a covert message to Moscow that would decide the fate of the war. He confirmed that Japan had no intention of attacking the Soviet Union. Japan was looking south, toward the Pacific and the United States. Stalin takes the gamble. He pulls the Siberian divisions from the east and puts them on trains headed west. While the Germans are inching toward Moscow, exhausted, freezing, and at the end of their supply lines, the trains are unloading thousands of fresh Soviet troops just behind the capital. By early December, the German vanguard acts like a dying runner reaching for the finish line. A reconnaissance unit from the 2nd Panzer Division actually reaches the town of Khimki, just 8 kilometers from the Moscow city limits. They are so close they can see the towers of the city. But they have nothing left. Their tanks are out of fuel, their men are zombies, they are a spent force. On December 5th, 1941, General Guderian writes, "The offensive on Moscow has failed. We underestimated the enemy's strength, as well as his size and climate. Fortunately, I stopped my troops on December 5. Otherwise, Catastrophe would be unavoidable. He was wrong about one thing. The catastrophe was not avoided. It was just beginning. Because the very next day, December 6th, the Soviet counteroffensive begins. It is not a small push. It is a tidal wave. The Siberian divisions, dressed in white camouflage, ghost out of the snowstorm. They hit the frozen, starving German lines with the force of a sledgehammer. The Germans are caught completely off guard. They are not used to retreating. Hitler has issued a no-retreat order. He forbids his generals to give up a single inch of ground. This order creates a crisis of command. The generals on the ground know that if they stay, they will be surrounded and slaughtered. But if they retreat, they face the firing squad for disobeying the Führer. The front line begins to buckle. The myth of German invincibility is shattered in the snow outside Moscow. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered Europe in weeks, is now running for its life. The equipment they so carefully transported is abandoned. Thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces are left behind. Frozen statues in the white landscape. This is the turning point, not just of the battle, but of the entire war. But the failure of Barbarossa runs deeper than just the weather or the Siberian troops. It was a failure of calculation. Germany had bet everything on a short war. Their economy was not mobilized for a long conflict. Their factories were not producing enough replacements. In 1941, while Germany was losing thousands of tanks, German factories were still operating on single peacetime shifts. They were still producing consumer goods. They had underestimated the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union. Even as the Germans captured the industrial west of Russia, the Soviets did something unprecedented. They dismantled entire factories, over 1,500 of them, packed them onto trains, and moved them east behind the Ural Mountains, out of range of German bombers. There, in the harsh wilderness, men and women worked in the open air, sometimes in -30 degrees, to rebuild the assembly lines. And soon, those factories were churning out tanks and planes in numbers that Germany could not dream of matching. The failure of Barbarossa was a failure of logistics. The German army was a beast with a small stomach. It required massive amounts of food and fuel, but it had a straw to drink through. The further they went, the thinner the straw became. By the end of 1941, the German army had suffered over 800,000 casualties. The flower of the German youth, the experienced veterans of Poland and France, were dead or crippled. The equipment loss was irreplaceable. They had kicked in the door, as Hitler said, but the structure did not fall down. Instead, the roof collapsed on top of them. The Battle of Moscow was not just a defeat. It was a revelation. For the first time, the world saw that the Wehrmacht could be beaten. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Hitler's armies since 1939 was gone, buried in the snowdrifts of Russia. But why? Why did Operation Barbarossa truly fail? Historians often blame the mud. They blame the cold. They blame the vast distances. These are all true, but the real reason lies deeper. It lies in the mind of the invader. It was a failure of ideology. When the Germans first entered Ukraine and the Baltic states, many locals welcomed them. They greeted the German soldiers with bread and salt. They saw them as liberators from Stalin's oppression. Had Germany capitalized on this, had they treated the local population with dignity, they might have turned the Soviet people against the Soviet state. But the Nazi ideology did not allow for allies in the East. It only saw Untermenschen, subhumans. Instead of liberation, the Germans brought extermination. The Einsatzgruppen, the death squads, followed the army, committing unspeakable atrocities. They burned villages. They starved prisoners. They treated the population not as potential partners, but as obstacles to be removed. This brutality backfired. It gave the Soviet people no choice. It turned a political war into a great patriotic war. The Russian soldier realized that surrender meant death. The Russian civilian realized that the German occupation meant slavery. So they fought, not just for Stalin, but for their right to exist. Behind the German lines, a massive partisan movement erupted. Ordinary farmers became guerrilla fighters. They blew up trains. They cut telegraph wires. The German supply lines, already stretched thin, were now bleeding from 1,000 cuts. The conquerors became the hunted. Then, there was the failure of economics. Germany had started a war of attrition, a war of numbers against a giant that had more men, more resources, and more resilience. In 1941, Germany produced about 3,000 tanks. The Soviet Union produced 6,000. By 1942, while Germany struggled to produce 4,000, the Soviet Union, with its factories now safe behind the Urals, churned out 24,000 tanks. It was a mathematical impossibility for Germany to win. They were fighting a war on borrowed time. And then, just days after the Soviet counterattack at Moscow, another event occurred that sealed Germany's fate. On December 11th, 1941, Hitler declared war on the United States. Now, Germany was fighting the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the industrial might of America simultaneously. The nightmare of a two-front war, the very thing German strategists had feared for a century, had become a reality. The failure of Barbarossa condemned the German army to a slow, agonizing death. The soldiers who marched into Russia in June 1941, singing and confident, were gone. Those who didn't die in battle died in captivity. Of the 3 million German prisoners taken by the Soviets during the war, only a fraction would ever see Germany again. Many would not return home until the mid-1950s, broken men in a broken country. But the tragedy of the Soviet people was even greater. The cost of stopping the invasion was apocalyptic. In the 6 months of Barbarossa alone, the Red Army lost over 4 million men. That is more than the entire population of some European countries. Entire generations of young men were wiped out. If you walk through a Russian village today, you will see the war memorials. You will see lists of names, surnames repeated 5, 6, 7 times. Brothers, fathers, uncles, all gone. The civilians suffered just as much. In the besieged city of Leningrad, people were eating glue, leather belts, and sawdust to survive. In the occupied territories, hunger was a weapon of mass destruction. Operation Barbarossa was the greatest invasion in history, but it was also the greatest miscalculation in history. It proved that you cannot conquer a nation simply by drawing lines on a map. You cannot calculate the will of a people to survive. Adolf Hitler had said, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." He did kick in the door, but he brought the roof down on his own head. The road to Berlin began at the gates of Moscow. It would be a long, bloody road, paved with the corpses of millions. It would take 4 more years of savage fighting. It would end with the red flag flying over the Reichstag. But the turning point was here. In 1941, when the snow fell, when the engines stopped, and when the giant awoke. This was Operation Barbarossa, a lesson in hubris, a testament to resilience, and a graveyard for ambition.